Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the cold stone holes and systematically frozen souls of the medieval monastery. The spiritual boot camp that promised salvation through turnip soup, mandatory midnight prayers, and the fine art of achieving enlightenment while your knees slowly disintegrated on cathedral floors. So before we begin this journey into organized holy suffering, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me explain how humans voluntarily imprisoned themselves for God. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what ungodly hour it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably lying in beds that are infinitely more comfortable than anything a medieval monk ever experienced. Now, dim those lights. Maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to spend some time in places where central heating was a heretical concept, and let's settle in for tonight's exploration together. So, you think you could handle medieval monastery life? Precious. Really? Like a tourist thinking they could survive a medieval winter, because they once went camping and only complained twice about the Wi-Fi. You imagine yourself finding spiritual fulfillment through simple living, meaningful work, and a close, knit community of devoted brothers. What you don't imagine is discovering that simple living means your mattress is essentially organized straw, meaningful work, involves intimate relationships with turnips, and that close, knit community means sharing sleeping quarters with men whose personal hygiene philosophy was that cleanliness might actually interfere with spiritual development. But sure, let's explore your inevitable spiritual awakening, shall we? Before you could even dream of achieving spiritual enlightenment through systematic starvation and sleep deprivation, you had to make it through the monastery gates. Medieval Christianity's version of a recruitment drive, except the only qualification they cared about was, does this man look like he can survive on turnips and self-loathing for the next 40 years? Step 1. Present yourself to Brother Grimwald, the monastery's gatekeeper. He's a man whose smile died sometime during the Crusades and whose breath could knock a Viking unconscious. You stand there, travel-worn and hopeful, clutching whatever pathetic possessions you've managed to scrape together. Grimwald examines you like a horse trader inspecting a particularly suspicious mare. Can you read? Bonus points. Can you write? Even better. Can you grovel convincingly while reciting Latin prayers you don't understand? Now we're talking? But here's the thing about medieval monasteries. They weren't looking for the cream of the crop. Soft. They were looking for men desperate enough to trade their entire existence for 3 meals of gruel and the vague promise that God might notice their suffering. Your background didn't matter much. Noble, welcome will take your inheritance. Peasant, perfect, you're already used to misery. Escaped serf, don't worry. The church has diplomatic immunity and your lord's arm doesn't reach quite this far. Criminal on the run. Even better, you'll work twice as hard to prove your devotion. If you made it past Brother Grimwald's inspection, congratulations. You are now considered suitable monastery material, which in medieval terms meant unlikely to immediately die and waste the porridge. And yes, you had to take vows. Not just any vows, the big 3: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Think of them as the holy trinity of personal misery. Poverty meant you owned nothing. Not even the moth-eaten robe they'd eventually give you. That belonged to God, which was convenient because God never seemed to complain about the fleas. Chastity meant, well, let's just say your romantic life was about to become as barren as the monastery vegetable garden in December. No women, no touching, no thinking impure thoughts. Good luck with that last one when you're sharing sleeping quarters with 40 other men who haven't bathed since the last feast day. Obedience was the real killer. Every word from your superiors was law. Brother Superior says jump. You ask how high while already in mid-air. He says scrub the cathedral floor with your own hair. You better start growing it out. Question and order. That's a paddling. Hesitate. That's a paddling. Breathe too loudly during prayer. You guessed it, paddling. But wait, you're not done yet. After taking your vows, you had to survive the novitiate period. Think of it as a year-long job interview conducted entirely in Latin by men who considered smiling a sin. During this delightful period, you were assigned to Brother Francis, a walking skeleton who'd forgotten how to speak above a whisper and whose idea of encouragement was not actively cursing your existence. Francis had been at the monastery for 37 years. 37 years of turnips, cold stones, and mandatory midnight prayers. He'd forgotten what women looked like, what ale tasted like, and why anyone would choose to live anywhere other than a damp stone cell that smelled perpetually of mildew and regret. Your cell, and calling it a cell was generous, considering actual prison cells had more amenities, measured roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. Just enough room for a straw mattress that had seen better centuries, a wooden cross that somehow managed to look disappointed in you, and a chamber pot that you'd learn to appreciate as your most faithful companion. The walls were stone, naturally, because comfort was the enemy of salvation. The window was a narrow slit that let in just enough light to remind you that somewhere out there, people were having fun without constantly worrying about their immortal souls. The door had no lock because privacy was a luxury reserved for people who weren't trying to get into heaven through systematic self-torture. Wake-up call came at 2 in the morning, not 2:30, not 2:15, 2 a.m. sharp, announced by Brother Matthias ringing a bell that sounded like a dying cow in an echo chamber. Miss the bell, that's a fast. Sleep through prayers, that's a longer fast. Complain about being tired. Fast so long you'll forget what food looks like. Matins, the first prayer service of the day, happened in complete darkness, because apparently God appreciated worship more when you couldn't see your own frozen breath. You'd stumble through the corridors with 40 other half-dead monks, guided only by the dim flicker of candles that Brother Thomas carried with the solemnity of a funeral procession. The chapel was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, which meant it was designed to make you feel as small and miserable as possible. Soaring stone arches that seemed to stretch into infinity, cold floors that sucked the warmth from your bones, and acoustics that turned every cough into a thunderous disruption worthy of divine punishment. You'd kneel on those stones for an hour, reciting prayers in Latin, while your knees slowly transformed into ground beef. The older monks had developed special kneeling techniques that involved positioning their bones in ways that defied basic anatomy. Brother Augustine, who'd been there since the Norman conquest, could kneel so still that pigeons occasionally mistook him for a particularly devout statue. After matins came lauds, because one pre-dawn prayer service wasn't enough spiritual punishment. Then prime, because apparently God needed to hear from you every few hours, or he'd forget you existed. Each service involved more kneeling, more Latin, and more opportunities to contemplate whether eternal damnation might actually be preferable to chronic knee pain. But the real joy began after morning prayers, work assignments. The monastery operated on a simple principle: idle hands were the devil's playground, so your hands were never, ever going to be idle. Brother Superior would announce the day's tasks with the enthusiasm of a man sentencing criminals to hard labor, which, when you thought about it, wasn't far from the truth. Kitchen duty meant rising at 1 a.m. to start preparing the day's meals. Meals, of course, being a generous term for what amounted to creative ways to make turnips palatable. Brother Cook was a man who'd forgotten that food was supposed to taste like something other than penance. His signature dish was a soup that somehow managed to be both watery and lumpy simultaneously, featuring chunks of mystery vegetables that may or may not have been edible when they were first harvested during the previous dynasty. Breakfast was bread and water. Not bread with water, bread and water, consumed separately, because combining them might constitute pleasure, and pleasure was suspicious. The bread was usually hard enough to use as a weapon, which was handy because occasionally you'd need to defend your portion from the monastery rats, who had standards and generally preferred to dine elsewhere. Garden duty was especially popular during winter, because there's nothing quite like digging frozen ground at dawn while contemplating your life choices. Brother Martin, the head gardener, was a man who spoke to vegetables with more warmth than he showed to humans. He developed a complex relationship with the monastery turnips, which was concerning on multiple levels. The garden tools were medieval, naturally, which meant they were designed by people who believed suffering built character. The hoe had a handle worn smooth by decades of blistered hands. The spade was just slightly too short for comfort, guaranteeing that every use resulted in back pain that would last until the next saint's day. The rake was missing several teeth, much like Brother Martin himself. But perhaps the most dreaded assignment was manuscript copying duty in the scriptorium. This might sound pleasant sitting indoors, working with books, exercising the mind. In reality, it was a special kind of torture designed for people who'd committed particularly creative sins in their previous lives. The scriptorium was run by Brother Ignatius, a man who'd perfected the art of finding fault with everything. Your handwriting was too loose, too tight, too creative, not creative enough. Your Latin was incorrect, your spacing was wrong, your ink was too thick, too thin, the wrong shade of black. He could spot a misplaced accent mark from across the room and would swoop down on you like a literary vulture. You'd spend 12 hours hunched over a manuscript, carefully copying text that you weren't allowed to read for comprehension, just reproduction. Your back would seize into permanent question mark shape. Your fingers would cramp around the quill until they resembled arthritic claws. Your eyes would water from squinting at letters by candlelight that barely qualified as illumination. And God forbid you made a mistake. Scraping ink off parchment was an art form that Brother Ignatius had mastered through decades of dealing with incompetent novices. He'd make you watch as he carefully removed your error, explaining in excruciating detail exactly how much that small mistake had cost in materials, time, and spiritual integrity. The ink, incidentally, was made from oak galls iron, and what Brother Ignatius claimed was wine, but smelled suspiciously like vinegar mixed with regret. Making ink was a weekly ritual that involved grinding ingredients with the same mortar and pestle that had been used since the monastery's founding. The resulting mixture was black, permanent, and had a tendency to stain everything it touched, including your soul. Midday brought the miracle of dinner, the main meal of the day, which consisted of whatever brother cook had managed to create from the monastery's limited resources. Resources being whatever vegetables hadn't completely rotted, whatever grain hadn't been claimed by weevils, and whatever hopes and dreams remained from the morning's optimism. The dining hall was a monument to medieval efficiency, meaning it was designed to feed maximum people with minimum comfort. Long wooden tables scarred by decades of use, benches that guaranteed splinters in uncomfortable places, and an atmosphere so thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and questionable food that it qualified as its own weather system. Meals were eaten in silence while one monk read aloud from religious texts. This wasn't entertainment, it was education through auditory torture. Brother Lawrence, who handled most of the readings, had a voice that could put a cathedral full of people to sleep, and a reading style that made even the most exciting biblical battles sound like inventory lists. You'd sit there, mechanically chewing bread that had the consistency of leather, listening to Lawrence drone through another thrilling passage about proper devotional practices, while trying not to notice that the monk next to you hadn't bathed since Christmas, and the one across from you was having a quiet but intense conversation with someone who wasn't there. After dinner came the afternoon work period, which was identical to the morning work period, except now you were working with a full stomach, which was actually worse because it gave you energy to fully appreciate your misery. The monastery operated like a small city, and every function needed constant attention from people who'd voluntarily signed up for a lifetime of unpaid labor. Stone repair was an ongoing necessity because medieval architecture was impressive but not particularly weatherproof. You'd spend hours mixing mortar, a combination of lime, sand, and what Brother Marcus cheerfully called secret ingredients, but which looked suspiciously like crushed bones from the monastery cemetery. Climbing scaffolding while carrying buckets of mortar-built character, Brother Marcus claimed, though it mostly built an intimate knowledge of which saints to pray to when you were convinced you were about to fall to your death. Brewery duty was simultaneously the most popular and most dangerous assignment. Popular because it involved Al, dangerous because it involved Brother Wilhelm, who took beer production more seriously than most people took their salvation. Wilhelm had been brewing for the monastery for 22 years, and in that time he'd developed theories about fermentation that bordered on the mystical. The brewery was located in the monastery's basement, which meant it was naturally cool, constantly damp, and smelled like a combination of yeast, hops, and centuries of accumulated brewing experiments gone wrong. Wilhelm would guide you through the process with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. Timing was everything, temperature was critical, and God help you if you contaminated a batch with your incompetence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that monks, who'd taken vows of temperance, were producing some of the region's finest ale. But Brother Wilhelm had worked out the theology. They weren't drinking for pleasure, they were drinking for sustenance. And they weren't getting drunk. They were achieving a state of spiritual reflection that happened to involve stumbling and singing. Library maintenance was another assignment that sounded better than it was. The monastery library was impressive, hundreds of books, manuscripts, and scrolls collected over centuries of scholarly dedication. It was also a paradise for insects, rodents, and various forms of decay that treated parchment like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Brother Theodore, the librarian, was a man who developed personal relationships with books that were more intimate than anything he'd ever had with humans. He knew every volume, every binding, every stain and tear. He could tell you which manuscripts were copied by which monks, which books had been damaged in which disasters, and exactly which scribes had the most illegible handwriting in monastery history. Your job was to carefully clean each book, check for damage, and report any problems to Theodore, who would receive news of book damage with the grief of a parent learning about an injured child. The cleaning process involved special brushes, careful attention to binding integrity, and a level of gentleness that most monks reserved for handling holy relics. The books themselves were fascinating, if you were allowed to actually read them rather than just maintain them. Theological treatises, historical chronicles, scientific works, and the occasional text that had been copied so many times that the original meaning had evolved into something entirely different. Brother Theodore claimed that some manuscripts contained copying errors that had achieved their own theological significance. Evening brought Vespers, another prayer service, because apparently your knees hadn't suffered enough during the previous 5 prayer sessions. Vespers had the advantage of being held by candlelight, which created a beautiful atmosphere right up until you realized that beautiful atmosphere was produced by burning animal fat that smelled like a barnyard fire. The evening meal was lighter than dinner, which was a relative term considering dinner barely qualified as substantial. Usually bread, sometimes cheese if the monastery was feeling prosperous, occasionally vegetables that hadn't made it into the afternoon soup. You'd eat by candlelight, still in silence, still listening to Brother Lawrence work his way through religious texts with all the passion of a man reading a grain inventory. After the evening meal came personal time, which was a generous term for the hour between supper and compline, when you were allowed to return to your cell and contemplate your existence. This was your opportunity for private prayer, personal reflection, and quietly questioning every decision that had led you to a life where turnip soup represented the day's highlight. Your cell, remember, was 6 feet by 4 feet of stone, walled solitude. The straw mattress had achieved a level of firmness that qualified as geological. The blanket was wool that had been woven by sheep with commitment issues. It kept you just warm enough to survive, while ensuring you never forgot you were cold. This was when homesickness hit hardest. In the silence of your cell, you'd remember what life had been like before you decided that salvation required systematic self-torture. You'd remember taverns where people laughed, markets where food had flavor, women who smiled at you instead of being forbidden to exist in your presence. But dwelling on such thoughts was dangerous territory. Longing for your previous life was a sign of weak faith. Missing worldly pleasures suggested insufficient commitment to spiritual growth. Brother Francis had warned you that the devil's favorite time to visit was during these quiet evening moments, when your defenses were down and your resolve was weakened by fatigue and hunger, so you'd pray. Not because you felt particularly spiritual, but because prayer was safer than thinking. You'd recite the same Latin phrases you'd memorized, words that had lost all meaning through repetition, but still provided a mental occupation that wouldn't get you in trouble with Brother Superior. Compline, the final prayer service of the day, happened just before bed. This was your last chance to commune with the divine, before falling asleep on a mattress that felt like it had been stuffed with good intentions and broken dreams. The chapel was even colder at night, if that was possible, and the candlelight created shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. The night prayers had a different quality than the daytime services. There was something about praying in near darkness that made the experience feel more intimate and more terrifying simultaneously. Your voice would join with 40 others in Latin chants that echoed off stone walls, creating harmonies that were genuinely beautiful and absolutely haunting. After compline came the great silence, no talking until after morning prayers. This wasn't just a rule, it was a mercy. After 18 hours of structured misery, conversation would have required energy that no one possessed. You'd return to your cell, remove your sandals, which had achieved new levels of discomfort through creative use of worn leather and inadequate cushioning, and collapse onto your straw mattress. Sleep came quickly, mostly because exhaustion was the monastery's most reliable sleeping aid. But it was never deep sleep, never truly restful sleep. The stones were too cold, the straw too lumpy, and Brother Marcus in the next cell had developed a snoring technique that sounded like a dying badger echoing through a cathedral. Plus, you knew that in just a few hours, Brother Matthias would be ringing that infernal bell, and the whole glorious cycle would begin again. But let's talk about the seasonal variations in this paradise of spiritual growth, because medieval monastery life wasn't content with merely being consistently miserable. It had to be creatively miserable depending on the time of year. Winter was special. Not special in a good way, but special in the way that frostbite is a special kind of pain. The monastery's heating system consisted of hoping that body heat and prayer would somehow combine to create warmth. It didn't work, but the theory was theologically sound. Your cell became an ice cave. The stone walls actually conducted cold more efficiently than they conducted heat, which was an impressive feat of medieval engineering. You'd wake up in the morning with frost on your blanket, and the chamber pot frozen solid. Morning prayers involved praying for feeling in your extremities, while reciting devotions through lips that had turned an alarming shade of blue. The chapel was particularly brutal in winter, because someone had decided that large, open spaces with high ceilings were perfect for spiritual contemplation. They were also perfect for creating wind tunnels that channeled every Arctic breeze directly onto kneeling monks. Brother Augustine claimed that chattering teeth added a percussive element to the prayers, but Brother Augustine had been there so long that his grip on reality had become somewhat flexible. Kitchen duty in winter meant working with ingredients that had been preserved through methods that prioritized longevity over palatability. Salted meat that had achieved the consistency of shoe leather, vegetables that had been pickled until they surrendered all resemblance to their original forms, and bread made from grain that had been stored so long it had developed its own ecosystem. But winter also brought Christmas, which was the monastery's attempt at celebration. Celebration being a relative term when your idea of festivity involved slightly more turnips in the soup and permission to smile during prayers without being accused of spiritual frivolity. The Christmas season meant special services, additional prayers, and the annual mystery play performed by monks who had no theatrical training and even less enthusiasm. Brother Paul, who organized the productions, had a vision that exceeded both his resources and his cast's abilities. The result was religious theatre that was more memorable for its disasters than its devotional message. Last Christmas, Brother Martin had played the angel Gabriel with such commitment that he'd fallen off the makeshift stage during the Annunciation scene. The Virgin Mary, played by Brother Thomas C., because someone had to do it, had giggled so uncontrollably during Martin's tumble that he'd broken character completely. The three wise men had gotten lost on their way to the manger, because Brother Lawrence had forgotten his lines and led them in circles around the chapel. But the audience, the other monks, had loved it precisely because it was such a beautiful disaster. For one evening, the monastery had felt like a place where humans lived rather than an institution designed to systematically remove all traces of humanity from its inhabitants. Spring brought different challenges. The monastery garden came alive, which meant endless hours of planting, weeding, and pretending to care about vegetables that would eventually become the same flavourless soup you'd been eating all winter. Brother Martin became insufferably optimistic during planting season. walking around the garden talking to seeds with the enthusiasm of a man who'd forgotten that dirt was just dirt. Spring also brought travelling pilgrims, which was both a blessing and a curse. Pilgrims meant news from the outside world, stories of places beyond the monastery walls, and occasionally donations that improved the quality of life marginally. They also meant additional mouths to feed, more laundry to wash, and constant reminders of the life you'd given up to pursue spiritual perfection. The pilgrims would arrive dusty, tired, and grateful for any shelter the monastery could provide. They'd share stories of their journeys, their destinations, their reasons for travelling. Some were seeking religious experiences, others were fulfilling vows, and a few were simply using pilgrimage as an excuse to see the world beyond their villages. Listening to their stories was both wonderful and torturous. Wonderful because it connected you to the larger world, torturous because it reminded you that people out there were living lives that involved choice, variety, and experiences that didn't revolve around prayer schedules and turnip cultivation. Summer was the monastery's closest approximation to pleasant, which meant the stones were only mildly cold instead of bone, numbingly frigid, and the garden actually produced vegetables that hadn't been pickled into submission. The longer days meant more work time, but they also meant more natural light, which was a luxury after months of squinting by candlelight. Summer also brought the harvest season, which was simultaneously the monastery's busiest and most satisfying time. There's something deeply gratifying about gathering food you've helped grow, even when you know that food will be transformed into the same monotonous meals you've been eating for months. Brother Martin would walk through the garden like a general surveying a successful battlefield, proudly displaying turnips, carrots, and cabbages that had achieved respectable size despite being grown in soil that was more stone than earth. The harvest meant preserving food for winter, which involved techniques that had been passed down through generations of monks who'd perfected the art of making vegetables last forever while ensuring they tasted like penance. Pickling, salting, drying, every method designed to prioritize preservation over palatability. But summer evenings in the monastery garden were genuinely beautiful. After Vespers, when your official duties were complete, you could walk among the vegetables and herbs while the sun set behind the monastery walls. The garden smelled like growing things instead of mildew and incense. You could hear birds that weren't Brother Matthias's bell. For brief moments, you could almost forget that you'd voluntarily imprisoned yourself in a stone box devoted to systematic self-denial. Autumn brought its own melancholy beauty, and the knowledge that winter was approaching with all its special miseries. The trees outside the monastery walls would turn colours that reminded you there was beauty in the world beyond turnip cultivation. The air would carry scents of wood smoke from villages where people were preparing for winter in ways that involved more than just adding extra straw to their mattresses. This was also when the monastery's isolation became most apparent. Villagers would prepare for winter by gathering in taverns, sharing stories, strengthening community bonds. The monastery prepared for winter by scheduling additional prayer services and reminding everyone that suffering built character. But let's discuss the monastery's social hierarchy, because even in a place devoted to humility and equality before God, humans couldn't resist creating systems of status and authority that would make medieval nobles proud. At the top was Brother Superior, also known as the Abbot, a man who'd achieved his position through some combination of spiritual devotion, administrative competence, and political maneuvering that would impress a Renaissance prince. Brother Superior lived in quarters that were almost comfortable, ate food that occasionally resembled actual cuisine, and had the authority to make decisions that affected everyone else's daily misery levels. Brother Superior was theoretically a spiritual leader, but practically he was more like a medieval CEO running a non-profit organization devoted to salvation through systematic discomfort. He handled relations with the outside world, managed the monastery's finances, and made policy decisions about everything from prayer schedules to turnip distribution. Meeting with Brother Superior was an experience that combined religious confession with job performance review. He'd listen to your concerns with the patience of a saint and the expression of a man calculating exactly how much penance your spiritual development required. His solutions to problems invariably involved more prayer, additional fasting, or work assignments that would help you appreciate the value of suffering. Below Brother Superior were the various brothers who handled specialized functions: Brother Cook, Brother Martin the gardener, Brother Theodore the librarian, Brother Wilhelm the brewer. These men had achieved positions of relative authority through expertise, seniority, or simple survival. They'd been at the monastery long enough to understand its rhythms and had developed the specialized knowledge that kept the institution functioning. Brother Cook, for instance, had mastered the art of creating meals from ingredients that most people would use for animal feed. His genius lay not in making food taste good, that would have been worldly vanity, but in making it nutritious enough to keep 40 monks alive, while bland enough to remind them that pleasure was temporary, but salvation was eternal. Brother Theodore had become the monastery's intellectual authority through decades of reading, copying, and maintaining texts that most of the other monks couldn't even pronounce correctly. He developed opinions about theological questions that wouldn't be settled for another few centuries, and he'd share these opinions with anyone brave enough to spend time in the library. Brother Wilhelm combined practical brewing knowledge with mystical theories about fermentation that bordered on alchemical. He'd explain the spiritual significance of yeast, while monitoring temperature with the precision of a man whose reputation depended on consistent alcohol production. His position was secure, because even the most devout monks appreciated the difference between good ale and monastic failure. Then there were the regular brothers, men like yourself who'd survived the novitiate period and achieved full membership in the monastery community. You had specific duties, assigned prayers, and the privilege of participating in decision-making processes that involved absolutely no actual decision-making authority whatsoever. Below the regular brothers were the novices, new arrivals, who were still learning the rules, still adjusting to the life, and still occasionally expressing emotions that suggested they remembered what happiness felt like. Novices were assigned to experienced brothers for guidance, which meant they got to benefit from the wisdom of men who'd forgotten why anyone would voluntarily choose this existence. And at the very bottom were the lay brothers, men who worked for the monastery but hadn't taken full vows. They handled the heaviest labor, the most unpleasant tasks, and they got fed last when food was scarce. They were technically part of the community, but excluded from decision-making, advanced religious education, and anything that might suggest they were equal to the brothers who'd made complete commitments to spiritual development through organized misery. The hierarchy wasn't just about authority, it was about gradations of suffering. Brother Superior suffered the burden of leadership and administrative responsibility. Specialized brothers suffered the weight of expertise and the pressure to maintain monastery functions. Regular brothers suffered the standard package of cold, hunger, and mandatory prayer. Novices suffered uncertainty and the constant fear of making mistakes. Lay brothers just suffered. But the real power in the monastery belonged to brothers who'd achieved unofficial status through sheer endurance. Brother Francis, your novice supervisor, wielded influence that had nothing to do with official position and everything to do with the fact that he'd survived 37 years of monastic life without going completely insane. These veteran brothers had developed coping mechanisms that bordered on supernatural. They knew which stones in the chapel floor were slightly warmer during winter prayers. They could predict Brother Cook's moods based on the sound of pots clanging in the kitchen. They'd mastered the art of sleeping while appearing to pray, praying while appearing to work, and working while appearing to pay attention to theological discussions. Brother Augustine, the monastery's senior resident, had achieved a Zen-like state where nothing surprised him, nothing disappointed him, and nothing excited him. He transcended ordinary human emotions and reached a plateau of existence that was either enlightenment or advanced emotional exhaustion. Younger monks couldn't tell the difference, and Brother Augustine wasn't talking. These senior brothers also served as the monastery's institutional memory. They remembered which policy experiments had failed spectacularly, which brothers had tried to escape and been dragged back, which seasonal variations in routine had resulted in increased mortality rates. Their advice usually consisted of warnings about things that seemed like good ideas, but would definitely end badly. Don't try to improve the bread recipe. Brother Francis had warned you during your first week. Brother Cook spent 3 years perfecting a formula that keeps us alive without encouraging gluttony. Suggest changes, and you'll spend the next month eating nothing but water and contemplating the sin of pride. The social dynamics were complicated by the fact that everyone was theoretically equal before God, while being obviously unequal in terms of comfort, authority, and access to resources. Brother Superior slept in a bed, while you slept on straw. Specialized brothers ate first, while novices ate whatever remained. Some brothers had private cells, while others shared space with men whose personal hygiene suggested different interpretations of cleanliness as a virtue. These inequalities were explained through theological reasoning that made perfect sense if you'd spent enough years having your logic systematically restructured by hunger and sleep deprivation. Hierarchy reflected spiritual development, responsibility, and God's mysterious plan for individual salvation through carefully calibrated levels of suffering. But the inequalities also created tensions that had to be managed through additional rules, extra prayers, and periodic reminders that envy was a sin that required immediate confession and extended penance. The monastery operated on the principle that spiritual growth required community, but community required constant vigilance against the human tendency to compare your misery level with your neighbor's slightly different misery level. Confession was the monastery's primary method for managing these tensions, which brings us to one of the most psychologically complex aspects of monastery life. Once a week, you'd kneel in a small, dark chamber and tell Brother Superior every sinful thought, impure desire, and spiritual failing you'd experienced since your last confession. This wasn't like modern confession, where you might mention a few minor transgressions and receive gentle guidance. Medieval monastery confession was a thorough psychological excavation conducted by a man who'd heard every possible variation of human weakness and had developed opinions about the spiritual significance of each category of failure. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," you'd begin, and then spend the next 30 minutes detailing every moment when you'd envied Brother Thomas's extra blanket, desired food that tasted like something other than penance, or wondered what life would be like if you'd made different choices. Brother Superior would listen with the patience of a professional interrogator, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he understood human psychology better than most people understood basic arithmetic. When you envied Brother Thomas's blanket, did you also question God's plan for your spiritual development? When you desired flavorful food, were you also rejecting the virtue of accepting whatever provisions divine providence has supplied? The penance that followed these confessions was precisely calibrated to address your specific spiritual weaknesses. Extra fasting for gluttony, additional prayer for pride, manual labor for sloth. Brother Superior had developed a comprehensive system that matched punishments to sins with the precision of a medieval accountant calculating taxes. But confession also served as the monastery's primitive psychological counseling system. During those weekly sessions, you could voice doubts, fears, and struggles that had no other outlet. Brother Superior might not offer comfort in any conventional sense, but he provided perspective that came from decades of helping men survive lives they'd chosen but didn't always understand. "Your homesickness is natural," he might say. "God tests our commitment by allowing us to remember what we've sacrificed. Your task is to transform that remembering into gratitude for the opportunity to serve something greater than immediate comfort." It was therapy conducted in a language of sin and redemption, but it was still therapy. The monastery understood that humans needed to process their experiences, even if that processing had to be filtered through theological frameworks that turned psychological struggles into spiritual growth opportunities. And then there were the special occasions, feast days, saints' days, and religious celebrations that broke the routine with variations that were somehow both festive and exhausting. Easter was the monastery's theological highlight, involving weeks of preparation that made regular monastery life seem relaxed by comparison. Lent meant additional fasting, extra prayers, and spiritual disciplines that pushed everyone's endurance to levels that tested the boundary between devotion and self. destruction. The Easter Vigil was a marathon religious service that began at sunset and continued until dawn, involving more prayers, more kneeling, and more Latin than any reasonable human should experience in a single evening. By the time the sun rose on Easter morning, you'd achieved a state of consciousness that was either spiritual transcendence or advanced sleep deprivation, possibly both. But Easter also meant the end of Lenten restrictions, which allowed for meals that almost qualified as food and beer that hadn't been watered down to homeopathic concentrations. The Easter feast featured meat, actual meat, not just the theoretical concept of protein and bread that had been made with flour instead of sawdust and good intentions. Saints' days provided smaller breaks in routine, usually involving special prayers dedicated to whichever saint the calendar deemed worthy of attention. These celebrations were opportunities to learn about holy men and women who'd achieved salvation through varieties of suffering that made monastery life seem almost comfortable by comparison. Saint Simeon Stylites, for instance, had achieved sainthood by spending 37 years living on top of a pillar, exposed to weather, eating only what people could hoist up to him, and never coming down except after death. Brother Theodore would read his story during the feast day meal, and every monk would contemplate whether their own suffering measured up to pillar-sitting standards. These stories served multiple purposes. They provided inspiration for monks who wondered whether their sacrifices were sufficient for salvation. They offered perspective on the relative comfort of monastery life compared to other paths to holiness. And they demonstrated that humans were capable of surviving conditions that would kill most people, which was reassuring when you were wondering whether you'd survive another winter of frozen chamber pots and turnip soup. The monastery also celebrated local saints, holy men and women, associated with the region who'd achieved recognition through combinations of piety, miracles, and good timing. These celebrations felt more personal because the saints had lived in familiar places, faced familiar challenges, and achieved sanctity without having to travel to distant lands or perform exotic varieties of self-torture. Saint Bede, for instance, had been a scholar and monk whose greatest achievement was writing history while living a life that closely resembled your own daily experience. His feast day reminded everyone that holiness could be achieved through intellectual work, careful scholarship, and the kind of patient endurance that characterized monastery life. But feast days also highlighted the monastery's isolation from the broader community celebrations that marked these same occasions. In villages and towns, saints' days meant festivals, markets, social gatherings, and forms of celebration that involved joy rather than additional prayer obligations. You'd sometimes hear echoes of these celebrations, distant music, laughter carried on the wind, sounds that reminded you that somewhere beyond the monastery walls, people were marking holy days with activities that seemed designed to produce happiness rather than spiritual growth through systematic discomfort. These moments of awareness were dangerous territory. Comparing monastery celebrations with worldly festivities could lead to discontent, which could lead to doubts about your vocation, which could lead to the kind of spiritual crisis that Brother Superior would need to address through increased fasting and additional manual labor assignments. So you'd learn to appreciate monastery celebrations for what they were, brief variations in routine that reminded you that life could be different without actually making it significantly better. The Easter feast was still mostly turnips, just turnips served with a slightly more festive attitude. Saints' Day prayers were still prayers, just prayers dedicated to specific examples of holy suffering rather than general requests for spiritual endurance. But let's discuss the monastery's relationship with the outside world, because despite its dedication to isolation and spiritual focus, the institution couldn't completely separate itself from the medieval society that surrounded it. Travelers would arrive seeking shelter, pilgrims would request prayers, local nobles would visit to demonstrate their piety, and occasionally messengers would bring news that reminded everyone that beyond the monastery walls, history was happening at a pace that didn't revolve around prayer, schedules, and turnip cultivation. These visits were simultaneously welcome and disruptive. Welcome because they brought news, variety, and contact with people who remembered what life was like beyond organized suffering. Disruptive because they required the monastery to function as a guest house, diplomatic institution, and social center while maintaining its primary identity as a place where men went to achieve salvation through systematic self-denial. Brother Superior would transform from spiritual leader to medieval hospitality manager, ensuring that visitors received appropriate accommodation while protecting the monastery's routine from excessive outside influence. This required diplomatic skills that weren't taught in theological training, the ability to be welcoming without being too welcoming, helpful without being too helpful, and informative without revealing information that might compromise the monastery's careful balance between worldly engagement and spiritual isolation. Noble visitors presented particular challenges because they arrived expecting treatment that reflected their social status, while visiting an institution theoretically dedicated to the principle that all men were equal before God. Brother Superior would house them in the monastery's best guest quarters, which were still essentially upgraded cells, with slightly more comfortable straw mattresses, while explaining that the monastery's commitment to simplicity meant that accommodations wouldn't match what they might expect at a castle or manor house. These nobles often came seeking prayers for specific intentions, successful military campaigns, favorable weather for harvests, divine intervention in political disputes, or spiritual insurance policies that might improve their chances of avoiding eternal damnation despite lifestyles that suggested different priorities. They'd make donations to the monastery in exchange for promises that the brothers would pray for their intentions, creating a spiritual economy that allowed worldly people to purchase religious services from men who'd theoretically rejected worldly concerns. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it wasn't discussed either. The monastery needed resources to continue operating, and nobles needed to feel that their wealth could somehow influence their spiritual destinies. The arrangement worked because both parties understood that divine favor might be more accessible through the prayers of men who'd given up everything to focus on spiritual development. Merchants presented different challenges. They arrived with practical needs: shelter, food, security for their goods, and they understood transactions in ways that made monastery economics more straightforward. They'd pay for accommodation, meals, and safe storage, treating the monastery like a medieval hotel that happened to include complimentary prayers with every stay. But merchants also brought temptation in the form of goods that reminded the brothers what they'd given up to pursue spiritual perfection. Spices that could transform even turnip soup into something approaching palatability. Fabrics that were soft, colourful, and warm. Tools that were well made, efficient, and designed by people who understood that human comfort wasn't necessarily incompatible with moral virtue. Brother Cook would inspect merchants' goods with the intensity of a man who'd forgotten that food could taste like something other than penance. Brother Martin would examine farming tools that were actually designed to work efficiently rather than build character through difficulty. Brother Theodore would review books and manuscripts that contained knowledge from beyond the monastery's intellectual boundaries. These interactions were carefully supervised because exposure to worldly goods could trigger desires that were incompatible with monastic vows. Brothers were encouraged to appreciate the quality of these items while remembering that attachment to material possessions was a spiritual hazard that required constant vigilance. Pilgrims were the most complex visitors because they came seeking spiritual experiences that the monastery was theoretically designed to provide, but their expectations often differed significantly from the monastery's understanding of what spiritual experience should involve. Many pilgrims arrived expecting miracles, healing, divine visions, or spiritual transformations that would justify the hardships of their journeys. The monastery could offer prayers, blessings, and access to holy relics, but actual miracles were beyond administrative control, despite what some visitors seemed to expect from their spiritual customer service experience. Brother Superior would explain that miracles appeared according to God's will and timing, not human schedules or expectations. The monastery could provide an environment conducive to spiritual growth, but individual spiritual experiences depended on factors that extended beyond institutional programming. Some pilgrims were disappointed by the monastery's commitment to routine over revelation. They'd expected dramatic spiritual experiences, mystical encounters, or at least religious services that were more emotionally engaging than the steady diet of Latin prayers and systematic discomfort that characterized daily monastery life. Others found exactly what they'd been seeking, a place where spiritual priorities took precedence over worldly concerns, where men had organized their entire lives around the pursuit of divine favor, and where the absence of worldly distractions created space for the kind of internal reflection that was impossible in more conventional settings. The most challenging pilgrims were those seeking escape from problems that couldn't be solved through prayer and penance. Men fleeing debts, legal troubles, family conflicts, or personal failures who imagined that monastery life might provide solutions to difficulties that were fundamentally worldly rather than spiritual. Brother Superior had developed considerable expertise in distinguishing between genuine spiritual vocations and attempts to use the monastery as a medieval witness protection program. He'd listened to their stories with pastoral patience while evaluating whether their motivations were compatible with monastic life's actual requirements. The monastery, he'd explain, is not a refuge from worldly problems. It's a different kind of challenge that requires its own forms of courage, commitment, and spiritual strength. Men who join us to escape difficulties often discover that monastery life creates new difficulties that are more demanding than the problems they left behind. But the monastery also served as a legitimate sanctuary for men whose worldly situations had become genuinely impossible through no fault of their own. Political refugees, survivors of local conflicts, or individuals whose circumstances had changed in ways that made their previous lives unsustainable could find genuine protection within monastery walls. These men often made successful transitions to monastic life because they understood that they were trading one set of challenges for another rather than expecting monastery life to be easier than what they'd left behind. Their gratitude for sanctuary often translated into commitment to the institution that had provided safety when they had nowhere else to turn. The monastery's role as sanctuary also created obligations that extended beyond spiritual services. When local conflicts arose, the institution had to maintain neutrality while providing refuge for non-combatants who needed protection. This required diplomatic skills that balanced political realities with spiritual principles. During regional disputes, the monastery might house refugees from multiple sides of conflicts, requiring Brother Superior to maintain peace among people whose external loyalties were incompatible, while ensuring that political tensions didn't disrupt the monastery's primary spiritual functions. These situations tested the monastery's commitment to treating all people equally while managing practical problems that arose when theological ideals encountered political realities. Brothers who joined the monastery to escape worldly complications found themselves dealing with exactly the kinds of human conflicts they'd hoped to avoid through spiritual isolation. But these challenges also provided opportunities to demonstrate Christian principles in practice rather than just theory. Caring for refugees, mediating disputes, and providing sanctuary for people in danger allowed the monastery to function as more than just a spiritual retreat center. It became an active force for practical Christian charity in a world that often prioritized power over compassion. Winter brought different kinds of visitors, travelers caught by weather who needed emergency shelter, merchants whose journeys had been disrupted by snow, and local people who required assistance during the season when survival became more challenging for everyone. The monastery's resources were always stretched during winter, but refusing shelter to people in genuine need would have contradicted the institution's fundamental Christian obligations. Brother Cook would somehow expand meals to accommodate additional mouths, even when existing food supplies were already inadequate for the monastery's residents. These winter emergencies created a different atmosphere within the monastery. The shared struggle against cold and scarcity created temporary bonds between brothers and visitors that transcended the usual careful boundaries maintained between monastic and worldly communities. You'd find yourself working alongside travelers to gather firewood, sharing blankets with pilgrims who hadn't expected to spend weeks trapped by weather, and participating in conversations that ranged far beyond the theological discussions that normally characterized monastery social interaction. These experiences provided perspectives on monastery life that were both humbling and reassuring. Humbling because they reminded you that spiritual dedication didn't automatically translate into practical wisdom or superior character. Reassuring because they demonstrated that the monastery's commitment to Christian charity was genuine rather than just theoretical. But spring's arrival would restore normal boundaries as visitors continued their journeys, and the monastery returned to its regular routine of spiritual development through organized discomfort. The brief period of expanded community would end, leaving behind memories of what life might be like with more variety, more human contact, and more opportunities for the kind of spontaneous interactions that monastery life was designed to minimize. These transitions from expanded community back to monastic isolation were emotionally challenging. You'd become accustomed to conversations that weren't restricted to spiritual topics, meals that included more people and occasionally more food, and daily routines that varied based on practical necessities rather than prayer schedules. The return to standard monastery life could feel restrictive after experiencing temporary expansions of social possibility. Your cell would seem smaller, your daily routine more repetitive, and your isolation more complete. These feelings required careful management through additional prayer, confession, and reminders that spiritual growth required consistency rather than variety. Brother Superior understood these transition challenges and would address them through individual counseling that helped brothers process their experiences while recommitting to monastic life's essential disciplines. The monastery, he'd explain, must remain open to the world's needs while maintaining its primary focus on spiritual development. Your challenge is to serve others while remembering that service itself can become a form of spiritual practice. But let's discuss the monastery's economic realities, because even institutions dedicated to poverty and spiritual development had to function within medieval economic systems that required resources, management, and practical skills that weren't necessarily included in theological education. The monastery owned land fields, forests, and pastures that provided resources for sustaining the community and generating surplus that could be traded for necessities that couldn't be produced locally. This land required management, agricultural knowledge, and labor organization that made the monastery function as both spiritual institution and medieval business enterprise. Brother Martin's expertise extended beyond the monastery garden to include crop rotation, soil management, and agricultural planning that determined whether the community would eat adequately or experience the kind of shortages that made spiritual fasting involuntary rather than voluntary. His decisions about which fields to plant, when to harvest, and how to preserve surplus crops directly affected everyone's survival prospects. The monastery's agricultural operations employed lay brothers and local workers who weren't full members of the community, but whose labor was essential for maintaining the economic foundation that supported spiritual activities. These workers were paid in food, shelter, and small amounts of money that allowed them to support families while contributing to the monastery's economic sustainability. Managing these relationships required skills that combined human resource management with pastoral care. Workers needed supervision, motivation, and dispute resolution, while the monastery needed to maintain productivity levels that ensured economic survival without compromising its spiritual priorities. Brother Wilhelm's brewing operation generated revenue through sales to local taverns, noble households, and merchant networks that valued the monastery's reputation for producing consistently high-quality ale. This commerce required understanding market conditions, maintaining customer relationships, and managing production schedules that balanced monastic routines with commercial obligations. The brewery also represented the monastery's most direct engagement with worldly economic activity. Brother Wilhelm negotiated prices, managed deliveries, and handled complaints from customers who expected professional-level service from a religious institution that theoretically prioritized spiritual concerns over commercial success. These commercial activities created theological tensions that required careful navigation. The monastery needed revenue to survive, but commercial success could lead to worldly attachments that were incompatible with spiritual development. Brothers involved in economic management had to maintain focus on spiritual priorities while developing practical skills that were essentially secular in nature. Brother Superior managed these tensions through policies that emphasized sufficiency rather than prosperity. The monastery would generate enough revenue to meet its needs, while avoiding the kind of commercial expansion that might transform a spiritual institution into a business enterprise that happened to include religious services. But economic pressures were constant and sometimes severe. Poor harvests, political disruptions, or changes in market conditions could threaten the monastery's financial stability in ways that required immediate practical responses, regardless of spiritual ideals. During economic crises, the monastery would need to reduce expenses, increase revenue, or find emergency resources that might require compromising some spiritual practices for the sake of institutional survival. These situations tested the community's commitment to spiritual priorities when practical necessities demanded different approaches. You'd participate in these economic realities through work assignments that contributed to the monastery's productivity while serving your spiritual development through manual labor. Your efforts in the garden, brewery, scriptorium, or other productive areas were simultaneously practical contributions and spiritual exercises designed to transform work into prayer. This integration of spiritual and economic activity was one of monastic life's most sophisticated achievements. Rather than separating spiritual development from practical necessity, the monastery created systems where daily work served both material and spiritual purposes, where economic productivity supported rather than competed with religious devotion. But the integration wasn't seamless, and tensions between practical and spiritual priorities required constant attention from brothers who'd expected monastery life to provide clearer separation between worldly and religious concerns. Economic pressures could overwhelm spiritual considerations, while spiritual ideals could interfere with practical necessities. These tensions were managed through community discussions, individual counseling, and policy adjustments that attempted to balance competing demands without completely sacrificing either practical sustainability or spiritual integrity. The monastery functioned as a continuous experiment in combining religious devotion with economic reality. And then there were the personal crises, individual challenges that tested your commitment to monastic life in ways that couldn't be resolved through additional prayer or increased fasting. Illness was a constant threat in a community where medical knowledge was limited, living conditions were harsh, and nutritional deficiencies were considered spiritually beneficial. Minor ailments could become serious problems when your body was already weakened by inadequate food, insufficient sleep, and exposure to cold and damp conditions. The monastery's medical care consisted of herbal remedies, prayer, and hoping that whatever was wrong would resolve itself before becoming fatal. Brother Marcus, who served as the community's medical expert, had learned healing techniques through experience rather than formal training, and his methods combined practical knowledge with spiritual faith in proportions that varied depending on the severity of the condition. Common ailments included joint problems from kneeling on stone floors, respiratory infections from sleeping in damp conditions, digestive issues from eating food that prioritized spiritual discipline over nutritional wisdom, and various forms of exhaustion from maintaining schedules that pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. More serious medical problems required decisions about whether to seek outside medical assistance, which meant compromising the monastery's self-sufficiency while potentially saving someone's life. These decisions balanced practical health concerns against spiritual principles that emphasized accepting whatever suffering God provided as opportunities for spiritual growth. Mental health challenges were particularly difficult because medieval understanding of psychological problems was limited and often interpreted through theological rather than medical frameworks. Depression might be understood as spiritual dryness requiring increased prayer. Anxiety could be viewed as insufficient faith requiring additional penance. More severe psychological problems might be attributed to demonic influence or spiritual failure. Brothers who experienced serious mental health crises often found themselves caught between spiritual explanations that blamed their suffering on personal spiritual inadequacy and practical needs for support that the monastery's resources couldn't adequately address. The institution's commitment to spiritual solutions didn't always provide effective responses to psychological problems that required different kinds of intervention. You'd witness brothers struggling with conditions that made monastery life more difficult while receiving advice to pray more, fast more, and trust more completely in divine providence. Sometimes this approach worked because the structure and community support provided by monastic life could help people manage psychological challenges. Sometimes it didn't work, and brothers would either leave the monastery or continue suffering without adequate support. Family emergencies presented different kinds of crises because monastic vows created tensions between religious commitments and family obligations. When parents became ill, siblings faced disasters, or family property was threatened, brothers had to choose between honoring their monastic commitments and responding to family needs. These situations were particularly challenging because they involved competing moral obligations rather than clear choices between right and wrong. Abandoning family members in crisis seemed morally questionable, but breaking monastic vows also involved moral failure. Brother Superior would counsel brothers facing these dilemmas, but ultimately individuals had to make decisions that balanced religious commitments against family responsibilities. Some brothers received permission to leave temporarily to address family emergencies, with the understanding that they would return to resume their monastic lives. Others discovered that family obligations were incompatible with monastic commitments and left permanently. A few attempted to manage both sets of obligations simultaneously, usually with results that satisfied neither spiritual nor family needs adequately. These personal crises often triggered broader questions about the sustainability of monastic life for individuals whose circumstances had changed since they'd made their original commitment. Marriage had been foregone for religious reasons, but what happened when those religious commitments conflicted with other moral obligations? The monastery provided counsel, support, and sometimes practical assistance, but ultimately individuals had to resolve conflicts between competing values that weren't easily reconciled through theological reasoning or spiritual discipline. Spiritual crises were perhaps the most challenging because they questioned the fundamental assumptions that made monastic life meaningful. After years of following routines designed to produce spiritual growth, some brothers would experience periods of doubt about whether their sacrifices were producing the intended results. These spiritual dry periods could last months or even years, during which prayer felt meaningless, religious services seemed empty, and the entire monastic enterprise appeared to be an elaborate exercise in self-deception. Brothers experiencing these crises would continue following monastery routines, while privately questioning whether their efforts were spiritually beneficial or simply wasteful. Brother Superior had extensive experience counseling brothers through spiritual crises, but his advice often involved encouraging people to continue practices that felt meaningless while trusting that meaning would eventually return. This required enormous faith from people whose faith was precisely what had become problematic. Some brothers worked through these crises and emerged with renewed commitment to monastic life. Others concluded that their spiritual development required different approaches and left to pursue alternative paths. A few remained in the monastery while privately maintaining serious doubts about the value of their chosen life. These spiritual struggles weren't discussed openly because acknowledging doubts could undermine other brothers' faith, while creating community tensions that would make everyone's spiritual development more difficult. Brothers experiencing crises would suffer privately while maintaining public commitment to practices they privately questioned. The monastery's response to these individual challenges reflected its understanding that spiritual development was ultimately an individual process that occurred within community structures but couldn't be guaranteed by institutional programs. The community could provide support, guidance, and resources, but individual spiritual outcomes depended on factors that extended beyond organizational control. As years passed in this environment, you'd notice changes in yourself that were both profound and disturbing. Your body would adapt to conditions that had initially seemed impossible, sleeping on stone, eating minimal food, maintaining physical activity despite inadequate nutrition, functioning with chronic sleep deprivation. But these physical adaptations came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Your health would deteriorate in ways that were accepted as normal consequences of spiritual discipline. Joint problems from constant kneeling, back pain from sleeping on inadequate surfaces, digestive issues from eating food designed for spiritual rather than nutritional purposes. Your mental processes would also change in ways that were simultaneously adaptive and concerning. You'd develop the ability to endure physical discomfort without emotional distress, to maintain routines regardless of your feelings about them, and to find meaning in activities that had initially seemed pointless. But these mental adaptations could also involve losing touch with aspects of yourself that had been essential to your pre-monastery identity. Your sense of humor might disappear because laughter was discouraged as incompatible with spiritual seriousness. Your curiosity about worldly topics might atrophy because such interests were viewed as distractions from religious focus. Most significantly, your ability to imagine alternative ways of living might diminish as monastery routines became so deeply ingrained that other possibilities seemed unreal or undesirable. This psychological adaptation made monastery life more bearable, but also made leaving more difficult even when circumstances suggested that departure might be beneficial. You'd watch other brothers navigate similar changes with varying degrees of success. Some seemed to flourish within monastic structures, finding genuine spiritual fulfillment through lives organized around prayer, work, and community service. Their commitment appeared authentic, and their spiritual development seemed real. Others appeared to be surviving rather than thriving, maintaining monastery routines without evident spiritual growth or personal satisfaction. They'd adapted to the life without embracing it, creating sustainable patterns of existence that met minimum requirements without achieving the spiritual transformation that theoretically justified their sacrifices. A few brothers seemed to be slowly deteriorating under the strain of maintaining commitments that were incompatible with their psychological or physical needs. They'd continue following monastery routines while gradually losing vitality, curiosity, and connection to sources of meaning that had originally motivated their religious commitment. These observations would force you to evaluate your own spiritual development and consider whether monastery life was producing the intended results in your individual case. This self-evaluation was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because spiritual growth required honest assessment. Dangerous because honest assessment might reveal that your sacrifices weren't generating proportional benefits. The monastery provided limited guidance for this kind of individual evaluation, because admitting that monastic life might not be suitable for everyone would undermine the institution's fundamental premises. Instead, difficulties were attributed to insufficient commitment, inadequate spiritual discipline, or temporary challenges that would resolve through increased faith and perseverance. But after years of experience, you develop your own criteria for evaluating whether your spiritual development was progressing satisfactorily and whether monastery life was the most effective path for achieving your religious goals. These personal assessments would need to be balanced against community expectations and institutional pressures that discouraged individual decision-making about fundamental life choices. And so the years would pass seasons of cold and hunger, moments of genuine spiritual insight, periods of doubt and recommitment, cycles of routine that created stability while gradually wearing away aspects of yourself that had existed before you'd chosen this path toward salvation through systematic self-denial. Whether this transformation represented spiritual growth or institutional conditioning remained an open question that each brother had to answer individually, privately, and without much external guidance from people who'd made similar choices and were therefore committed to believing that those choices had been wise. The monastery would continue its ancient routines, regardless of individual outcomes, providing structure for spiritual development while maintaining institutional survival through economic activities that required practical skills alongside religious devotion. It would remain a place where men could pursue spiritual goals through methods that were simultaneously time-tested and personally challenging in ways that extended far beyond initial expectations. Your daily life would continue prayers before dawn, work assignments that combined spiritual discipline with practical necessity, meals that sustained life while discouraging attachment to worldly pleasures, and sleep that prepared you for another day of pursuing divine favor through human endurance. The bells would continue ringing, the seasons would continue changing, and the questions about whether your sacrifices were spiritually beneficial would continue requiring answers that you'd provide through continued commitment to a way of life that had seemed more comprehensible when viewed from outside its daily realities. This was monastery life, a comprehensive system for spiritual development that demanded everything while promising rewards that remained largely invisible to external observation and sometimes questionable to internal evaluation. It was simultaneously humanity's most ambitious attempt to create heaven on earth and its most systematic method for discovering that such attempts involved challenges that extended far beyond initial expectations. Whether it was worth the cost remained a question that each man had to answer for himself, alone in a stone cell, surrounded by others who'd made similar choices for similar reasons, and were equally uncertain about whether their sacrifices would ultimately prove to have been wise.